What if I told you that some of today's bigger global conflicts, especially, the tension between the West and Iran,
Hmm.
what if the way we understand it is based on a story that's been, well, twisted for literally thousands of years?
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about a few that shaped centuries. Coups, sanctions, standoffs.
Mm.
It's all there. But the roots go way, way deeper than most people think.
Right.
To really get a handle on today, you almost have to go back over 2,000 years, back to the Persian Empire. And this isn't just dry history. It's like an origin story playing out good versus evil, freedom versus tyranny. Still echoes today.
And that story, the one we generally hear, it's often, let's say, very simplified and
Yeah.
definitely biased. You know the saying, the victors write the history books?
Yeah, definitely.
Well, it really applies here. If you want to understand why the West has these deep-seated views about Persia and now modern Iran, you first have to look at Persia's relationship with ancient Greece. That's where it all starts.
Okay, that makes sense. Because when we think about Western culture's foundations, ancient Greece, particularly Athens, looms large. It's seen as the cradle, right? Philosophy, science, and crucially, democracy. I mean, universities have whole departments for the classics. They're seen as that fundamental to Western civilization.
Exactly. And it's fascinating how that view got cemented. It really ramps up during the Renaissance, that rebirth, of interest in Greek stuff after the quote-unquote Dark Ages.
Right.
But here's the kicker, the really interesting bit. How did those Greek texts survive? They were preserved, translated, studied in Arabic.
Yeah.
Preserved in the Islamic world, then translated into Latin, making them available to Europe. That access, that translation effort is basically what made the Renaissance possible.
Wow.
And then you jump forward to the Enlightenment. Thinkers then were massively inspired by Greek reason, logic. They saw themselves as the inheritors of that legacy. Athenian democracy became this symbolic ancestor for new ideas about liberty, citizenship.
And right in the middle of shaping that story is Herodotus, the father of history.
Oh, yes, Herodotus.
He wrote the first big historical work in the West, right? Said he wanted to make sure the great deeds of Greeks and barbarians weren't forgotten. But his version, it really set the tone, didn't it, for centuries?
Oh, profoundly, yeah. His work basically frames the Persians as the enemy, the tyrant against the free Greeks. He wrote things like, no Greek would even hear the word Persian without terror, always portraying them as this despotic regime.
He didn't pull any punches. Those famous Greco-Persian Wars, a Marathon, Thermopylae, Salamis, the Stuff 300 the movie is based on. He didn't just report them. He turned them into these moral battles, good versus evil.
Moral epics. The Greeks were the free and brave underdogs fighting for liberty itself against these barbaric and cruel Persian monarchs. That's the narrative he pushed. And that helped create this whole idea of the tyrannical, despotic East.
An idea that just never went away.
Never really did. It stuck around through the Renaissance, influenced how Europeans saw the world, and then when they started exploring and encountering new peoples, well, guess what? Those people often got labeled barbaric too, using the same old lens.
Okay, so if our whole Western origin story is so tied up in Greece being the good guy, the beacon of freedom, then the obvious question is, how much of that story about the other side, about Persia, is actually true? What if it's just wrong?
Well, yeah, that's the critical point. Almost everything we think we know about the Persian Empire, it comes from Greek sources.
Written by their enemies.
Written by their enemies. Imagine trying to understand, say, the U.S. today only by reading Russian or Chinese state media from the Cold War. You'd get a very skewed picture.
Definitely. So what's the real story then? What was the Persian Empire actually like?
Okay, let's look at the Achaemenid Empire founded by Cyrus the Great. This thing was huge. At its peak, the largest empire the world had ever seen, stretching from Libya to India, think about that,
Wow.
and home to nearly half the world's population at the time.
Half the population. That's staggering. How did they manage that? Was it this harsh despotism Herodotus described?
Actually, no. Quite the opposite, it seems. The defining characteristic, the thing that made it work, was tolerance.
Tolerance.
Yeah. It thrived by allowing this incredible diversity, different customs, languages, religions, to coexist. It became a model, really, for how to run a massively diverse empire.
Okay, give me an example.
The Cyrus cylinder. Ever heard of it?
Vaguely. Reminds me of something from a museum display.
Right. It's this ancient clay cylinder from 539 BC, and inscribed on it are decrees guaranteeing people the right to worship their own gods, speak their own languages, return to their homelands if they'd been displaced. It's often called the First Bill of Rights.
The First Bill of Rights in 539 BC.
And get this, Cyrus actually funded the rebuilding of the Jewish temple in Jerusalem after the Babylonian exile. He's praised for it in the Hebrew Bible. That doesn't sound like a typical barbaric tyrant, does it?
Not at all. Okay, so Cyrus sets this town. What about later rulers?
Darius the Great built on it. He wasn't just about conquest. He built infrastructure roads connecting the empire, standardized currency, created this really advanced administrative system. It was so effective, future empires, including the Romans, basically copied parts of it.
A model for administration, too. But hang on. If Persia was so tolerant and well-run, how did the Greek tyrant narrative take hold so strongly? Didn't any Greeks see this?
That's another fascinating twist. Some did. A Greek historian named Xenophon actually wrote a whole book, the Cyropedia, praising Cyrus the Great. He presented him as a model ruler, wise and just.
A Greek historian praising Cyrus.
Yep. And this book wasn't some obscure text. It was considered a masterpiece, read by Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar. And here's a real mind-bender, the founding fathers of America. Thomas Jefferson reportedly had multiple copies and referred to it.
Jefferson read a book praising Cyrus the Great, while founding a nation supposedly based on Greek ideals that demonized Persia.
Exactly. The irony is pretty thick, isn't it? It shows this hidden intellectual debt, even while the public narrative was completely different.
Okay, that's huge. What about slavery? Because the Western narrative is all about freedom, born in Greece.
Ah, slavery. This is where the picture gets really inverted.
How so?
Under the Persians, large-scale chattel slavery, the kind where people are property, was generally frowned upon. The empire functioned differently.
Okay.
The Greek city-states, however, Athens, Sparta, their societies, their economies, their famed democracy, built fundamentally on slavery.
Built on slavery.
Absolutely. Take the Spartans, those famous warriors. They owned slaves, the helots, who outnumbered them something like 7-1.
7-1.
Yeah. And they were so afraid of rebellion, they had this annual ritual where they would legally declare war on their own slaves just so they could kill any helots they thought were too strong or might organize without facing murder charges.
That's horrifying.
It is. So when we talk about Athenian democracy, we have to remember who it was for. It was for slave-owning men. That was the freedom being celebrated, not exactly universal liberty.
So the supposed tyranny frowned on slavery, while the cradle of freedom depended on it and brutalized slaves. That completely flips the script.
It really does. And Persian history didn't stop there, of course. Their contributions kept coming for centuries, things that are still massively overlooked in the West.
Like what? Beyond empire management and early human rights idea.
Oh, huge contributions during the Islamic Golden Age, where Persian thinkers were central. Think about medicine. Ibn Sina, known as Avicenna in the West. His canon of medicine was the standard medical textbook in Europe for over 600 years.
6 centuries.
Think about philosophy. Al-Farabi, who expanded on Aristotle's logic and influenced Christian and Jewish thinkers later on. Think math. Al-Khwarizmi. We literally get the word algebra from his work. He basically invented it.
He invented algebra.
Pretty much. And astronomy. Al-Biruni calculated the Earth's radius with incredible accuracy centuries before Galileo. These weren't minor figures, they were giants. Science, philosophy, math, medicine, poetry, architecture. Their work, translated into Latin, fueled the European Renaissance and the development of universities.
So it wasn't just Greece feeding the Renaissance. It was this whole other stream of knowledge, much of it Persian or flowing through Persia.
Absolutely. History isn't this neat line from Greece to Rome to us. It's messy, interconnected. Civilizations borrow, build on each other. Persia was a massive part of that exchange, with these multilingual teams translating Greek, Persian, Arabic texts, creating this incredible intellectual ferment.
Which brings us back to today, because this isn't just about correcting the history books, is it?
Not at all. It's about how history gets used, how it's weaponized, even now.
How so?
That old story, the West as the good guy, the defender of liberty, and the East, especially Persia, as the eternal, irrational threat, that story is alive and well.
You see it in the news all the time.
All the time. Look at how Iran is often portrayed. This looming, scary power obsessed with nuclear weapons, often presented in a vacuum, without the complex history or, acknowledging other actors in the region. It taps right into that ancient us versus them narrative.
It's like the modern version of Athens versus Persia?
Exactly. Just like Athens was framed as the lonely democracy against Persian tyranny, you sometimes hear Israel framed as the only democracy in the Middle East against, big, scary Iran. It's the same playbook, updated.
And the irony, as you pointed out, Western civilization defines itself by reason, liberty, freedom, but those very traditions were often preserved, refined, even arguably born, and the East it sometimes demonizes. And the West itself hasn't exactly had a spotless record when it comes to upholding liberty and freedom throughout history, has it?
Not even close. That's the profound irony. It forces you to really question the stories you're told, the foundations you take for granted.
So the takeaway here seems to be, when you hear these grand narratives, especially when the West tells you who its friends and enemies are, you really need to ask, who wrote this story? And maybe more importantly, who got written out?
Precisely.
Looking at history this way, through a different lens, it shows how powerful perspective is, how crucial it is to look beyond the easy, dominant story.
Definitely. And understanding this isn't just an academic exercise about ancient history. It genuinely changes how you might view today's news, today's conflicts. It makes you wonder, what other historical villains might be more complicated, more nuanced, maybe even heroic in ways we haven't been allowed to see? It encourages that critical look at the narratives shaping our world right now.
Absolutely fascinating stuff. If you found this deep dive thought-provoking, definitely hit that like button and make sure you subscribe to the Geopolitics Gazette YouTube channel. We'll be digging into more topics like this, challenging assumptions and exploring the deeper currents shaping our world.